The courtroom was filled with people, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Everyone seemed restless, shifting in their seats or leaning forward to get a better view. J.D. Vance stood at the center of it all, his posture straight and confident. His suit was neatly pressed and his tie was perfectly knotted, giving him an air of authority that matched his reputation. He had spent years building his career as a prosecutor, known for being relentless when pursuing justice. Today, however, felt different. This case wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about exposing something much darker. To his left sat Rachel Monroe, a young journalist with short brown hair tucked behind her ears. She clutched a notepad tightly in one hand and a pen in the other, ready to capture every word spoken. Her wide eyes darted between J.D. Vance and the judge's bench, trying to read the emotions on everyone's faces. Beside her was Paul Carter, a man in his late 30s with a rugged appearance. His arms were crossed over his chest and his jaw was clenched. He had been instrumental in bringing this case to light, though few in the room knew it yet. Both Rachel and Paul understood how significant this moment could be, not just for the legal system but for the countless lives affected by corruption. At the front of the room sat Judge Harold Klein, an older man with thinning gray hair and deep lines etched into his face. He wore his black robes like armor, trying to appear composed despite the tension hanging thick in the air. For decades, he had ruled courtrooms with an iron fist, earning respect and fear from those who came before him. But today, he looked uneasy, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench as if bracing himself for what was coming next. J.D. Vance cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. The murmurs died down, replaced by an eerie silence that made even the smallest sound echo through the space. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with several spectators before finally speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, "what we are about to discuss here today will shake the very foundation of our justice system." Rachel scribbled down his words quickly, her pen moving across the paper almost frantically. She didn't want to miss a single detail. Next to her, Paul leaned slightly forward, his piercing blue eyes fixed on J.D. Vance. There was a flicker of satisfaction in his expression. He had waited a long time for this day. Vance paused briefly, letting his words sink in. Then, without hesitation, he pulled out a folder marked "Confidential" and held it up for everyone to see. The label was bold enough to catch the attention of even the most distracted person in the room. "This folder contains undeniable proof of misconduct," he continued, his tone firm. "It reveals a pattern of corruption so egregious that it threatens the integrity of everything we hold dear." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people exchanged shocked glances, while others simply stared at Vance, waiting for him to explain further. Even Judge Klein shifted uncomfortably in his seat, though he tried to maintain his composure. "For months now," Vance went on, "we have investigated allegations against Judge Harold Klein. These allegations suggest that he has used his position of power to orchestrate secret deals designed to protect criminals in exchange for personal gain." As he spoke, he opened the folder and pulled out a stack of documents. Each page contained detailed records of financial transactions, emails, and photographs. These documents show wire transfers from offshore accounts directly into Judge Klein's personal holdings. They also include communications implicating him in altering rulings to favor defendants tied to dangerous criminal organizations. The room grew quieter still, the kind of silence that felt heavy and oppressive. It was as if no one dared to breathe. Rachel stopped writing for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected something big when she first heard rumors about this case, but nothing could have prepared her for what she was hearing now. Corruption at such a high level? It seemed almost impossible to believe. Paul, on the other hand, remained calm. He had seen enough during his time as a police officer to know that corruption existed everywhere. You just had to look hard enough to find it. What surprised him, though, was the scale of it all. This wasn't some small-time bribery scheme. It was a web of deceit stretching far beyond the courtroom. As J.D. Vance laid out each piece of evidence, Judge Klein's face turned pale. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, and his hands trembled ever so slightly. He glanced toward his defense attorney, Greg Morrison, who sat nearby looking equally uneasy. Morrison whispered something under his breath, but Klein didn't respond. Instead, he focused his gaze on the floor, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Among the spectators was Linda Harper, a middle-aged woman clutching a photograph of her younger brother. Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened to Vance's words. Her brother had died because of one of the manipulated verdicts mentioned in the investigation. She had come to the courthouse hoping for answers, and now, hearing the truth laid bare, she felt a mix of anger and relief. Anger at the injustice done to her family, but also relief that someone was finally holding the guilty accountable. Back, at the center of the room, J.D. Vance concluded his opening statement by emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "This isn't just about one corrupt judge," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's about the ripple effect of his actions, the lives destroyed, the trust broken, and the damage inflicted on our society. We cannot allow this to continue." With that, he placed the folder back on the table and returned to his seat. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Then, slowly, the murmurs started, again, growing louder as people processed what they had just heard. Reporters scrambled to leave the room, eager to file their stories before anyone else. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones were thrust into the faces of anyone willing to comment. Rachel stayed seated for a moment longer, her mind racing. She glanced at Paul, who gave her a subtle nod. They both knew this was only the beginning. Whatever happened next, they were determined to uncover the full truth no matter where it led them. The courtroom was alive with tension as J.D. Vance prepared to present the next phase of his case. The folder marked confidential lay open on the table before him, its contents spread out like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly, their curiosity piqued by what they had heard so far. But now came the real test, proving the allegations against Judge Harold Klein beyond any doubt. Vance turned toward the large screen mounted on the wall and pressed a button. Instantly, images of wire transfer records appeared, showing money moving from offshore accounts into personal holdings linked to Klein. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars exchanged over the course of several years. These transactions, Vance explained calmly, pointing to specific entries, were made under false pretenses. They represent bribes paid to Judge Klein in exchange for favorable rulings. The murmurs in the room grew louder as people tried to process the enormity of what they were seeing. Even those who had suspected foul play couldn't believe how blatant it was. Rachel Monroe scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every detail she could. She glanced at Paul Carter briefly. He nodded almost imperceptibly, signaling that this evidence matched what he had uncovered during his investigation. But Vance wasn't done yet. After explaining the financial records, he moved on to another piece of evidence: emails between Klein and individuals tied to criminal organizations. These messages revealed explicit discussions about altering verdicts, suppressing evidence, and even influencing jury decisions. One email caught everyone's attention. It included a detailed plan to sabotage a high-profile drug trafficking trial. Vance read parts of it aloud, his voice steady but laced with disgust. "This is not speculation," he said firmly. "This is proof of deliberate actions taken to undermine justice." As Vance wrapped up this portion of his presentation, he called the next witness to the stand, Emily Dawson. A young clerk who worked directly under Judge Klein, Emily looked terrified as she walked slowly to the front of the room. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses, and her eyes darted nervously around the crowded courtroom. Rachel felt a pang of sympathy for her. Testifying against someone as powerful as Klein must have been incredibly daunting. "Ms. Dawson," Vance began gently, trying to put her at ease. "Can you tell us about your role in Judge Klein's office?" Emily swallowed hard before answering. I handled administrative tasks," she stammered. "Filing documents, managing schedules, things like that." Her voice was soft, barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. Vance nodded encouragingly. And during your time there, did you ever notice anything unusual? Anything that seemed out of place? Emily hesitated, clearly struggling with whether or not to speak. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "Yes. Sometimes, late at night. When everyone else had gone home, Judge Klein would stay in his chambers. He'd lock the door and turn off the lights, but I could hear him talking on the phone. Once I accidentally walked in because I thought something might be wrong, and I saw him tampering with case files. He told me to forget what I'd seen, but..." She trailed off, tears welling up in her eyes. The courtroom erupted into whispers, but Vance quickly regained control. "Thank you, Ms. Dawson," he said softly. "Your courage today will help bring justice to many people." Emily nodded weakly, wiping her cheeks with trembling fingers. Rachel watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding. This was the kind of story journalists dreamed of uncovering, a whistleblower stepping forward to expose the truth. She jotted down quotes from Emily's testimony, knowing they would be crucial for her article. Beside her, Paul remained silent, his expression unreadable, but Rachel could see the intensity in his eyes. He was piecing everything together, connecting dots that others might miss. Meanwhile, Judge Klein shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face was pale, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He avoided looking at Emily, instead focusing on his defense attorney, Greg Morrison. Morrison whispered something to him, but Klein didn't respond. It was clear that the pressure was mounting. To counter the prosecution's claims, Morrison stood up and addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone confident. "Despite the circumstances, what we're seeing here is nothing more than circumstantial evidence. My client has served this community faithfully for decades, and these accusations are baseless attempts to tarnish his reputation." Vance didn't flinch. Instead, he played his trump card, audio recordings of clandestine meetings involving Klein. The first recording featured Klein agreeing to suppress key evidence in a major drug trafficking case. His voice was unmistakable, filled with greed and arrogance. "If we bury this evidence," he said in the clip, "the defendant walks free and our friends get what they want. Simple as that." The courtroom fell silent as the recording ended. Even Morrison seemed shaken, though he tried to mask it. Linda Harper, sitting among the spectators, clutched her brother's photograph tightly, tears streaming down her face. For years she had wondered why justice hadn't been served in her siblings' case. Now, hearing Klein's own words, she finally understood. As the session drew to a close, Vance summarized his arguments one last time. "We've shown you financial records, emails, testimony from a credible witness, and audio recordings," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "Each piece of evidence points to one inescapable conclusion. Judge Harold Klein has betrayed the trust placed in him by the public. He has sold his integrity for personal gain, and the consequences of his actions are far-reaching." The judge, overseeing the case, Judge Laura Simmons, called for a recess, slamming her gavel down to restore order as murmurs filled the room. Outside, reporters swarmed the exits, eager to capture reactions from anyone leaving the courtroom. Rachel stayed, behind, reviewing her notes and mentally organizing her thoughts. She knew she had enough material for a groundbreaking article, but she also realized the story was far from over. Paul approached her after the crowd thinned out. "You think Morrison's going to try to discredit Emily?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that only Rachel could hear. "It's likely," Rachel replied, frowning. "He'll do whatever it takes to protect Klein. But if we can find more witnesses, or better yet, concrete proof linking Klein to the syndicate, we might be able to shut him down for good." Paul nodded thoughtfully. "I'll keep digging," he promised. "There's got to be more out there. Someone always slips up." As they parted ways, Rachel felt a mix of excitement and dread. Exposing corruption was dangerous work, especially when dealing with powerful figures like Klein. But she also knew that backing down wasn't an option, not when so much was at stake. With Paul's help, she was determined to follow the trail wherever it led, no matter how perilous it became. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as the afternoon session began. Everyone knew this was the moment that could make or break the case against Judge Harold Klein. J.D. Vance stood tall, his confidence unwavering despite the mounting pressure. He adjusted his tie slightly before addressing the court again. "Your Honor," he said, turning toward Judge Laura Simmons, "I'd like to present additional evidence that will further demonstrate Judge Klein's involvement in these corrupt activities." Rachel Monroe sat on the edge of her seat, pen poised over her notepad. She had already written pages of notes, but she sensed something big was coming. Beside her, Paul Carter leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He could feel the energy shift. This wasn't just another day in court. It was the tipping point. Vance walked back to the table where the folder marked "Confidential" lay open. From it, he pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the stand. The device looked ordinary, but everyone in the room knew it contained something extraordinary. "This recording," Vance explained, "was obtained from a secure source who wishes to remain anonymous. It captures a private conversation between Judge Klein and an associate tied to the criminal syndicate we've been discussing." Before playing the recording, Vance turned to face the crowded courtroom. His gaze swept across the spectators, lingering briefly on Klein, whose face had grown visibly paler. "What you're about to hear is undeniable proof of Judge Klein's role in altering legal outcomes for personal gain," Vance added, his tone firm and deliberate. With a click of a button, the recording began. The voice of Judge Klein filled the room, clear and unmistakable. "If we suppress this evidence," he said in the clip, "the defendant walks free and our friends get what they want. Simple as that." There was a pause, followed by another, voice agreeing enthusiastically. The room fell silent save for the faint hum of the recorder. When the clip ended, Vance let the weight of the words sink in. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Greg Morrison, Klein's defense attorney, seemed stunned into silence. For a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. Then slowly, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged shocked glances, shaking their heads in disbelief. Judge Laura Simmons slammed her gavel down firmly, calling for order. "Quiet," she demanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Once the room settled, she turned to Vance. "Proceed, Mr. Vance," she instructed, her expression unreadable. Vance nodded respectfully and continued. "As you can see, Your Honor, this evidence leaves little room for doubt. Judge Klein has been actively collaborating with criminals to manipulate the justice system. These actions are not only illegal, but also fundamentally undermine public trust in our institutions." Klein's defense attorney finally found his voice. Morrison stood up abruptly, his face flushed with frustration. "Your Honor, this so-called evidence is nothing more than hearsay," he argued, gesturing wildly. "My client denies all allegations, and I urge the court not to jump to conclusions based on unverified recordings." But Vance wasn't fazed. "Unverified?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "These recordings were authenticated by forensic experts, and their origins have been traced to credible sources. Furthermore, they align perfectly with the financial records and emails we've already presented." Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, clearly struggling to find a counter-argument. Instead, he sat back down, muttering under his breath. Klein, meanwhile, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his hands gripped the edge of the bench as if trying to steady himself. Outside the courtroom, reporters buzzed with excitement. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward anyone willing to comment. Rachel took advantage of the recess to step outside and gather her thoughts. Standing near the courthouse steps, she reviewed her notes, piecing together the story she planned to write. This was huge. Not just local news, but something that could resonate nationwide. Paul joined her shortly afterward, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "That recording changes everything," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "It ties Klein directly to the syndicate. If we play our cards right, this could bring down the entire operation." Rachel nodded, though she couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. "Do you think Morrison knows more than he's letting on?" she asked. He seemed rattled when Vance mentioned the authentication process. "It's possible," Paul replied thoughtfully. "Someone like Morrison doesn't survive long in this game without having connections. We need to be careful. If word gets out that we're digging deeper, things could get dangerous." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion inside the building. A bailiff emerged, shouting for everyone to return to the courtroom immediately. Rachel and Paul exchanged a quick glance before rushing back inside. When they arrived, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Emily Dawson, the nervous clerk who had testified earlier, was nowhere to be seen. Her chair at the witness stand sat empty, and whispers spread quickly among the spectators. Rumors flew. Some claimed she had fled out of fear, while others speculated that she had been silenced. J.D. Vance addressed the court once again, his voice tinged with urgency. "Your Honor, it appears that Ms. Dawson has vanished," he announced, holding up a crumpled note that had been left behind. "This message was found on her desk. It reads, 'They know. Don't trust anyone.'" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Spectators began talking loudly, speculating about what might have happened to Emily. Linda Harper, still clutching her brother's photograph, burst into tears, overwhelmed by the implications. Could Emily's disappearance mean there were others involved? Was someone working to cover up the truth? Judge Simmons called for silence repeatedly, finally managing to restore some semblance of order. "Mr. Vance," she said sternly, "what steps are being taken to locate Ms. Dawson?" "We're coordinating with law enforcement agencies," Vance replied, his tone measured despite the gravity of the situation. "Her safety is our top priority, but her absence only strengthens the case against Judge Klein. Whoever orchestrated her disappearance must have realized how crucial her testimony is." As the hearing resumed, Rachel noticed something peculiar. One of the junior prosecutors, Daniel Hughes, kept glancing nervously at his phone. His behavior seemed odd compared to the rest of the team, who appeared focused and determined. Rachel nudged Paul and nodded discreetly in Hughes's direction. "Do you think he's involved?" she whispered. "It's possible," Paul murmured back. "His family has ties to wealthy elites. If someone pressured him into leaking information." Rachel didn't respond, but she made a mental note to investigate further. By the end of the session, the courtroom was abuzz with theories and questions. As people filed out, Rachel approached Paul once more. "We need to figure out what's going on behind the scenes," she said firmly. "There's more to this than meets the eye." Paul nodded in agreement. "Let's start with Hughes," he suggested. "And keep your eyes open. Whoever's pulling the strings won't hesitate to eliminate anyone standing in their way." Together, they left the courthouse, fully aware that the stakes had just gotten higher. The road ahead promised danger, but neither Rachel nor Paul was willing to back down. They were determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. The days following Emily Dawson's disappearance were filled with tension and uncertainty. The courtroom drama had spilled into the streets, capturing headlines across the nation. Reporters scrambled to uncover new details, but no one seemed closer to finding the missing clerk. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance worked tirelessly to ensure the case against Judge Harold Klein stayed on track, even as whispers of betrayal began to circulate within his own team. Rachel Monroe spent every waking moment chasing leads, determined to piece together the puzzle. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something far beyond Judge Klein or the local syndicate. Her instincts told her to dig deeper, and so she did. Late one evening, while reviewing old files and transcripts, she stumbled upon something unusual, a series of payments made to offshore accounts linked not only to Klein, but also to several high-profile figures in politics and business. These weren't small sums. They were massive transfers, suggesting a network far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Determined to share her findings with Paul Carter, Rachel called him immediately. "Paul," she said urgently when he answered, "I think we're dealing with something international. This isn't just about Klein. It's about an entire system designed to protect criminals worldwide." Paul listened intently, his brow furrowing as Rachel explained what she'd uncovered. "If you're right," he said slowly, Then we need concrete proof. Documents like that won't hold up unless we can trace them back to their source. I know, Rachel replied, but I have a lead. Someone tipped me off about an abandoned warehouse near the docks. They said there might be evidence stored there. Things too dangerous for anyone else to touch. Paul didn't hesitate. Send me the address. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. The warehouse was dark and eerily quiet when Rachel and Paul arrived. Moonlight filtered through cracked windows, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Crates were piled high, their labels faded and illegible. The air smelled of rust and damp wood, and the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of metal beams overhead. Stay close, Paul whispered as they stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Rachel nodded, clutching her notebook tightly. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the secrets hidden here pressed down on them both. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. Near the back of the warehouse, Paul spotted an open crate filled with strange devices, small, sleek gadgets unlike anything he'd seen before. Beside them lay rolled-up blueprints marked with cryptic symbols and diagrams. He knelt down to examine them more closely, his fingers tracing over the intricate designs. "What are these?" Rachel asked, peering over his shoulder. "I'm not sure," Paul admitted, his voice low. "But whatever they are, they're advanced, way beyond standard tech. Look at this blueprint. It shows some kind of weapon capable of disabling power grids. If this gets into the wrong hands..." He trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. Rachel shivered despite the warm night. "Do you think Klein knew about this, or was he just a pawn in a much larger game?" "Hard to say," Paul replied. "But whoever's running this operation clearly has resources and influence. We need to get this information to Vance as soon as possible." As they gathered the blueprints and snapped photos of the devices, a faint sound caught Rachel's attention. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from somewhere outside the warehouse. She froze, her heart pounding. "Paul," she whispered, urgently, "we're not alone." Paul grabbed the flashlight and turned it off, plunging them into darkness. "Stay quiet," he murmured, pulling Rachel behind a stack of crates. They crouched low, listening intently as the footsteps grew louder. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide. A beam of light swept through the doorway, illuminating the space briefly before disappearing again. Two men entered, speaking in hushed tones. Rachel strained to hear their conversation, catching snippets about moving the shipment and avoiding detection. One of them carried a crowbar, which he used to pry open another crate nearby. "We can't let them see us," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "If they catch us..." "They won't," Paul interrupted firmly, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. "When I say go, run straight for the exit. Don't look back." Rachel nodded, her pulse racing. She trusted Paul, but the situation felt impossible. How could they escape without being noticed? The men continued working, unaware of the intruders, hiding mere feet away. Finally, Paul signaled silently, counting down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. Then, with a burst of speed, they darted toward the door, staying low to avoid detection. The sound of their footsteps blended with the creaking of the floorboards, masking their movements, at least for now. They reached the exit just as one of the men turned around, shouting something in alarm. Paul pushed Rachel ahead of him, urging her to keep running. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Rachel glanced back once, seeing the glow of flashlights bouncing wildly as their pursuers closed in. "Keep going," Paul shouted, his voice steady despite the chaos. They kept going until they reached Rachel's car, parked a safe distance away. Panting, they climbed inside, slamming the doors shut just as headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A black sedan sped past, its tires screeching as it rounded the corner. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly, her hands trembling. "That was too close," she finally said, her voice shaky. Paul nodded, leaning back in his seat. "Yeah, but we got what we came for. And now we know who we're dealing with, or at least part of it." Rachel looked at the bag containing the blueprints and photos, her mind racing. "This changes everything," she said softly, If we expose this, it won't just bring down Klein. It'll take down everyone involved, the whole network. Paul met her gaze, his expression serious. Then we'd better make sure we're ready. Because once this hits the news, there's no turning back. As Rachel started the engine and drove away, she couldn't help but feel a mix of fear and resolve. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had her determination. Together, she and Paul vowed to uncover the truth. No matter where it led or how dangerous it became. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room as J.D. Vance stared intently at the laptop screen before him. Rachel Monroe had just finished explaining everything she and Paul Carter had uncovered at the warehouse. The encrypted devices, the futuristic blueprints, and the close call with whoever had been guarding them. Vance's expression shifted between disbelief and determination as he scrolled through the photos they'd brought back. "This changes everything," Vance finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that made both Rachel and Paul sit up straighter. "If what you found is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it, then we're dealing with something far bigger than corruption within our justice system. This is global." Rachel nodded, clutching her pen tightly. "It looks like Judge Klein wasn't the mastermind. He was just a piece of a much larger puzzle. Whoever's behind this has access to advanced technology and resources most people can only dream of." Paul stepped away from the window where he'd been keeping watch and moved closer to the desk. "And they're willing to do whatever it takes to protect their operation. That chase at the warehouse? It proves they're watching us. We need to be careful moving forward." Vance rubbed his temples, clearly overwhelmed but unwilling to back down. "We'll need to act fast," he said. "If word gets out that we're onto them, they'll cover their tracks or worse, escalate their plans." He gestured toward the blueprints spread across the table. "Do we know for sure what these weapons are capable of?" Rachel flipped through her notebook, finding the section where she'd jotted down details about the designs. "From what Paul and I could gather, it's some kind of electromagnetic pulse device. It's designed to disable power grids over large areas. Imagine entire cities plunged into darkness. Hospitals, airports, communication networks, all gone in an instant." Vance's jaw tightened. "And if this falls into the wrong hands, it could destabilize entire regions. Governments would accuse each other of sabotage, sparking chaos on a massive scale." Paul chimed in, his tone grim. "That's exactly why they're framing rival nations. They'll use the weapon to create conflict between countries, then step in to profit from the fallout. It's not just about money. It's about control." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation sinking. What started as an investigation into local corruption had spiraled into something far more sinister. They weren't just fighting for justice anymore. They were fighting to stop a catastrophe. Later that night, Rachel returned to her apartment, exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind raced with questions. Who else was involved? How deep did the conspiracy go? She opened her laptop and began cross-referencing names and companies tied to the offshore accounts she'd uncovered earlier. As she worked, one name kept appearing: Daniel Hughes, the junior prosecutor who had seemed nervous during the hearings. Rachel frowned, recalling how Vance had expressed suspicions about Hughes leaking information. Could he be connected to the syndicate? Or was he simply being manipulated because of his family ties to powerful elites? Either way, she knew they couldn't ignore the possibility. She sent a quick message to Paul, summarizing her findings. Within minutes, he responded, "I'll look into Hughes tomorrow. In the meantime, don't trust anyone, not even Vance. If this goes higher up than we think, we're all potential targets." Rachel sighed, shutting her laptop. Trust was becoming a luxury she couldn't afford. The next morning, chaos erupted at the courthouse. News broke that Daniel Hughes had vanished without a trace, leaving behind shredded documents in his office. Among the fragments, investigators found references to government officials and corporate executives implicated in the scheme. It was clear someone had silenced him before he could talk. J.D. Vance called an emergency meeting with Rachel and Paul to discuss the latest development. "This confirms it," he said, pacing the room. "Hughes was feeding information to Klein, or whoever's pulling the strings. Now that he's gone, we're running out of leads. Rachel hesitated before speaking. What about Emily Dawson? Do we have any updates on her? Vance shook his head. Nothing yet, but I've got agents working around the clock to find her. Until then, we focus on what we have. Paul leaned against the wall, arms crossed. There's one thing we haven't considered, he said slowly. Whoever's running this operation must have a weak link somewhere. No organization is perfect. If we pressure the right people, someone will crack. Vance stopped pacing and turned to face him. You're suggesting we start flipping witnesses? Exactly, Paul replied. People like Emily Dawson, or even lower-level members of the syndicate. Offer them immunity or protection in exchange for testimony. Someone will talk eventually. Rachel nodded, seeing the logic in Paul's plan. But we'll need evidence to back it up. Otherwise, they won't believe we can protect them. That's where the blueprints come in, Vance said, pointing to the documents still lying on the table. If we can prove the existence of this weapon and its intended use, we'll have leverage. Enough to make even the most loyal followers reconsider their allegiances. As the day wore on, the trio worked tirelessly to piece together a strategy. Rachel drafted articles carefully worded to hint at the broader conspiracy, without revealing too much, hoping to draw attention without tipping off those involved. Paul reached out to contacts within law enforcement, discreetly gathering intelligence on key players in the syndicate. Meanwhile, Vance prepared to present the new evidence in court, knowing it could either break the case wide open or put them all in grave danger. By evening, exhaustion set in, but none of them dared to slow down. They knew time was not on their side. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath its surface. Inside the dimly lit office, the air felt heavy with anticipation. We're close, Rachel said softly, breaking the silence. I can feel it. Paul glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Close doesn't mean safe. If we're right about this, then exposing the truth might make us bigger targets than ever. The final day of the trial arrived and the courtroom was packed to capacity. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. Spectators whispered among themselves, anticipation buzzing in the air. At the center of it all stood J.D. Vance, calm and composed, ready to deliver the closing arguments that could seal Judge Harold Klein's fate and potentially dismantle an entire criminal empire. Rachel Monroe sat in the front row, her notepad resting on her lap. She had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, ensuring every detail of her investigation was documented and shared with Vance. Beside her notes lay a copy of the article she had written, exposing the conspiracy piece by piece. It would go live as soon as the verdict was announced, sending shockwaves across the nation. Paul Carter lingered near the back of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't just there to witness history. He was there to ensure no one interfered. After everything they'd uncovered, the blueprints, the syndicate's plans, the disappearances, they knew the stakes were higher than ever. If Klein walked free, it wouldn't just be a failure of justice. It would be a declaration of war against anyone who dared challenge the system. D. Vance approached the podium, his voice steady and commanding as he began. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, what we have witnessed over these past weeks is nothing short of a betrayal, not only of the law but of the very principles upon which our society is built. Judge Harold Klein has used his position of power to serve himself and those who sought to exploit our justice system for profit and control. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But this case goes far beyond one man. What we've uncovered is a web of corruption stretching across borders, involving individuals in positions of authority, corporate leaders, and even foreign entities. These people do not care about laws or morality. Their goal is simple: power, and they will stop at nothing to achieve it. Vance gestured toward the large screen behind him, where images of financial records, emails, and blueprints were displayed. This weapon, he said, pointing to the design of the electromagnetic pulse device, represents the tip of the iceberg. Its purpose? To destabilize nations, create chaos, and allow its creators to manipulate global events for their gain. This is not speculation, this is fact, and Judge Klein played a role in facilitating its development. As Vance spoke, Klein sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, he looked like a broken man. Greg Morrison, his defense attorney, leaned close to whisper something, but Klein didn't respond. He simply stared at the floor, knowing the weight of the evidence was too much to overcome. Rachel watched closely, her heart pounding. She thought of Emily Dawson, whose bravery had set this chain of events in motion, and Daniel Hughes, whose disappearance served as a grim reminder of the risks involved. She also thought of Linda Harper, sitting quietly in the audience, clutching her brother's photograph. This wasn't just about bringing down Klein, it was about giving hope to those who had suffered because of his actions. When Vance concluded his argument, the courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Laura Simmons, overseeing the proceedings, seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. She called for closing statements from Morrison, who struggled to mount a coherent defense. His attempts to discredit the evidence fell flat, met with skepticism from both the judge and the jury. Finally, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. As the foreman stood to speak, every eye in the room turned toward him. "We find the defendant, Judge Harold Klein, guilty on all counts," he declared, his voice echoing through the tense silence. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause broke out among the spectators. Linda Harper buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat, her pen trembling slightly as she wrote the headline for her article. Justice served. Judge Klein convicted in global corruption scandal. Federal agent stepped forward to escort Klein out of the courtroom. As he passed by, his eyes met Vance's briefly, filled with a mixture of anger and resignation. It was over, for him at least. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around. Vance, Rachel, and Paul eager for quotes and reactions. Rachel pushed through the crowd, heading straight for her laptop to publish her report. Within minutes, her article went viral, sparking outrage and calls for further investigations into the syndicate's operations. Meanwhile, Paul stayed behind, coordinating with federal authorities to execute raids on multiple locations tied to the conspiracy. Thanks to the evidence gathered, agents arrested key figures across industries, seizing assets and dismantling critical nodes of the operation. The futuristic weapon was secured, its threat neutralized before it could be deployed. That evening, Rachel and Paul met at a quiet cafe to reflect on everything that had happened. "It's not over," Paul said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "There are still people out there, powerful people, who won't give up easily." "I know," Rachel replied, sipping her tea. "But today proves something important. No matter how big or dangerous the fight, truth and justice can prevail if enough people stand together." Paul nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "And we'll keep fighting. For Emily, for Linda, and for everyone else who deserves answers." As they left the cafe, the city skyline glowed against the night sky, a symbol of resilience and hope. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but Rachel and Paul were determined to see it through. Together, they vowed to continue, uncovering the truth, knowing that justice was never truly finished. It was an ongoing battle, one they were proud to fight.